But welcome to the May 25th Michigan Farm-to-Institution Network virtual network meeting. This meeting is being presented kind of in conjunction with a project that Mariel Borgman and I are working on as part of our role with MSU Extension on educating around on-farm food safety, specifically for the farm-to-institution kind of environment or practitioners. So that project is being funded through a Michigan Department of Ag and Rural Development food safety education grant. So just wanted to call out the support from MDARD for this and welcome you all. So today we're gonna talk through a lot of different stuff related to on-farm food safety and kind of how food safety is impacted across the farm to institution supply chain. We're going to do some introductions and connecting on. We've got a nice question to tee us up for thinking about summer and getting outside and visiting our favorite spots around Michigan. I'm going to be providing a quick just run through of some of the results of a survey that we did in over last year to kind of collect some data around how much do people even know or understand from the institutional side about on-farm food safety and those certifications. So we'll have kind of just set the stage a little bit to kind of preview like why we think this, this information is really important and these programs are really important. We're going to have Phil Britton from the Michigan Group Gap Network and Fresh Systems LLC give us some information about kind of essential produce safety all across that farm to institution supply chain, why it's important, why this is something that we're talking about, and kind of helping kind of us understand that on a more kind of cohesive level. Mariel is going to be giving us an overview of some on-farm food safety programs, specifically some certification, verification programs, and what those mean and how we can better understand that. And then we're really excited. We're going to bring you a case study from Kalamazoo Valley Community College's Valley Hub. And they're going to talk about kind of their role as a regional distributor, how they kind of promote on-farm food safety for both the farmers that they work with, as well as and talking with the institutional buyers that they work with. We'll run through a couple MIFIN updates and then we'll wrap things up. So with that, I think I'm going to pass it back to Mariel for taking us through some intros and our connecting question.
Awesome. Thanks, Garrett. Welcome, everyone. So Garrett, I don't know if you introduced yourself or not, but I'll just say again that Garrett Ziegler is my colleague. We're both MSU Extension Community Food Systems educators, and we'll be co-moderating and facilitating the meeting today. And then Abby Palmer, who's our colleague also in MSU Extension Community Food Systems, is going to be our note taker. And the three of us are part of the MIFIN management team. So we're excited to be with you today and bring this information to you. We want to know who else is here. So if you could just pop in the chat box your name and where you're from, that way we can see who's here today. Looks like Phil Britton is here, who's one of our speakers, so that's good. And Colleen Matz is here from MIFIN and MSU CRFS. Same with Noel. Wendy, our colleague at MSU Extension and the MSU Product Center. Got Rachel Baer from Kalamazoo Valley Community College, Valley Hub. Marianne Romsek from Bloomfield Hills. John McCarthy from MIFS. Oh man, they're coming in quick. We've got Linda Stull from MDE. Rosie Florian from Valley Hub also. Alex Palzowitz from UP Food Exchange and Taste Local Difference, Tina Reynolds from Michigan Environmental Council, Lauren Barnhart also from KVCC, Lori Yelton from MDARD, Jen Silveri from MIFS, Zaire Parati from MIFIN, Lindsay Scalera from MSU CRFS, Michigan Good Food Charter, and Wendy Crawley from MDE. All right, so keep those coming. Welcome everyone, and we're just gonna do a quick icebreaker connection question here. Oh, Xavier is here as well. Xavier from Methodist Children's Home Society. Okay, so for our connect question today, we thought it would be fun to hear everyone's favorite spot in Michigan. So whether that's your favorite beach, your favorite park, The only rule is it needs to be in Michigan. So thank you for that. Congratulations, Colleen. Congratulations to Xavier on your new gig. So yep, go ahead in the chat again and put in your favorite spot, and it may be your own bed. I like that. Lake Superior Beach, South Haven, lots of beaches, Grand Traverse Lighthouse, Ludington State Park. Any state park, all right. Oh, Colleen says her backyard, which is in full bloom right now. Sturgeon Bay, a family frequenting lake, and any Michigan Great Lake. See that beach right there along Lake Michigan, west of St. Ignace. Anywhere on or around Lake Michigan, Saugatuck Dunes, Leelanau, lots of folks loving on Lake Michigan, and I'm with you. Rosie has an experiential description here, driving along Lake Michigan after you cross the bridge, heading west, and then jumping out to get in the water. That sounds cold, that far north, but I bet it's very refreshing. Sunset anywhere in the UP, the beach at the mouth of the Platte River near Crystal Lake. Lovely. All right, that is giving me some wanderlust. I want to go get on the road and check out some of these places, and I hope that you all have some plans to get to some of these beautiful places this summer. All right, I'm going to move us into the next slide and pass it back over to Garrett.
All right. Thanks, Mariel. So as I said, when I was running through our introduction, just going to briefly talk through some of the process and results that went into the development of the produce safety survey that we did last summer that Mariel and I worked on, along with some other partners at the Wallace Center and Phil from Fresh Systems. Just to kind of, we really were curious as far as, how much do institutional food service buyers, staff, nutrition staff, how much do they really know and understand about on-farm food safety, and really also like how much, who do they rely on to kind of provide them that information or ensure that the food that they're receiving is safe. So next slide, please, Mariel. All right. So just briefly talk through kind of how the process of developing this survey. So really this actually started way back in 2017 when Mariel and Miffin developed just a quick pilot survey, kind of trying to just understand here, at least here in Michigan, what institutions we're currently thinking and understanding as far as on-farm food safety is concerned. So we piloted a very short, small survey way back in December of 2017 at Great Lakes Expo. We did get some results from that that were released into a report about a year later that was looking at how institutional food service professionals know that the produce that they're getting is safe. And that's really important, as we'll talk through today. It's just a really important aspect of farm to institution is ensuring that the food that's produced on the farm, processed, distributed, and then eventually served in cafeterias or patient rooms is safe. So since we did that survey way back in 2017, there have been kind of ongoing discussions about taking that survey, expanding it as a nationwide survey. And as part of we kind of were gearing up to do that. And then back in March 2020, right as COVID was happening or starting to hit, we presented kind of about this idea and about some of the results from our Michigan survey at a National Good Food Network conference in New Orleans. And kind of that was our place to where we were really looking to kick off things and kind of present this idea to a wider audience. And then did some more survey development and strategy with Wallace Center and some others. And then last July, we sent the survey out into the world. got some findings back, and then did actually an initial presentation last October at the Michigan Good Food Summit. So just to kind of set the stage there, next slide, please. So this is just a quick example of kind of how we use to get the information out. We created a nice little card to talk through, what information we're looking for, survey link, that sort of thing. But it was really just a way to, really kind of spread the word, make sure we got a decent number of responses as part of this survey. Next slide, please. All right, so getting into some of the data. So I think, we had hoped to get a pretty good representation of not only geographically across the country, but also institutional wise, different types of institutions responding to this survey. I would say, we got a decent geographic representation. We had 18 states represented. But overall, the majority of responses, not really unsurprisingly, came from Michigan. So 58 of our responses were from Michigan. We really, obviously, our networks, the access that we have to have the institutional buyers is strongest here in Michigan and around the Midwest. So that really skewed a little bit of our responses. But we expect that a lot of this data is similar, kind of no matter which state you might be working in or your institution might be based in. So as far as institutional types represented, we're hoping to get a pretty diverse set. We did get responses from many different types of institutions, but overall, the highest majority of institutions represented in the survey respondents was the K through 12 education, which is really, an important, probably the most important institutional sector or type that we, tend to work with here in our farm to institution work. So we did get some really great data back from them. Next slide, please. So we asked a question about, in your institution, who decides which assurance programs are required for fresh produce suppliers? We thought this was really important because we wanted to better understand, who at the institution is making these decisions. Is it something that food service directors and nutrition directors are? Is it this chef? Is it based off of some specific compliance department? What we really found was that the majority of responses, the compliance department, the folks maybe at a higher up level, or the risk management folks, were the ones that were really making the decision about, which specific assurance program or third-party certification an institution might be accepting. There were obviously a good number of also places that had either a food service or nutrition director, an executive or head chef making those decisions as well. But we even had 10% of those institutions said that they didn't even really know who was making that decision, that it might have been a previous food service director, or it was just kind of, that's their standard operating procedure and that's what they've done. So that's kind of what they carried on doing. So, we thought that was a really important question because, so much of the education that we do around farm institution, the work we do is with that food service, nutrition director, head chef, executive chef. And this gives us another audience to try and, better understand where they're at with why they're requiring different programs, or kind of how they make those decisions. So I thought this was a really, really interesting point to kind of hone in on. Next slide, please. So we really kind of were interested in, institutions and whether or not they actually require some specific produce safety verification. We often hear that institutions, if you want to sell to an institution, you have to be GAP certified. And what this survey has shown is that's not always necessarily the case. So a little over half of all the institutions we surveyed did say they required some specific produce safety verification, but there was a third that specifically said we do not require it. We did have some folks who they weren't exactly sure if their institution requires it. So just kind of one of those unknown things, or something that maybe is out of their hands. And then as far as which things they specifically required within that half, 54% that did require some, and most really have said that they had the same requirement for all of the produce they buy. So whether that's from a distributor or directly from a farmer, USDA harmonized GAP was the most commonly accepted that was from food hubs. And when buying directly from farms, a written food safety plan or farm visit is a popular way to kind of do some form of verification. And we did ask some distributors this, or what they're working with distributors, was followed by that they weren't 100% sure. And then after that was USDA harmonized GAP. So some interesting results there. Next slide, please. So just trying to understand how familiar these food service directors institutions are with those specific requirements that are involved in some of these verification programs that Mariel's going to kind of run us through in a little bit. Really found that the highest numbers were that they were not at all familiar. And so this really demonstrated to us that there is this knowledge gap in, on the institutional purchaser side, as far as what really is required from a farm to meet these specific certifications. So that's really one of the things. This question right here is really what has, kind of facilitated the need for this specific program that you're all at today to really educate institutions about what goes into some of these on-farm food safety programs, what's involved from a farmer standpoint, and how much work is really involved in that. Next slide, please. So we did ask about, how satisfied people were and these institutions were, and with the current produce safety assurance programs that they're using. And we did find that most are either extremely satisfied or somewhat satisfied. We also asked about their interest in exploring other options for produce safety programs, and also found that a lot of them, even though they were satisfied, were definitely up and interested for exploring some of these other produce safety programs that are out there. So again, that really kind of showed us that this education is really important, that institutions, I think, are interested in learning more and wanting to explore what other options are out there, even though they may already be satisfied with their current programs. Next slide, please. So kind of thinking through what this means for some of these different aspects of the farm to institution supply chain, looking at maybe farms and supply chain partners, distributors, and then institutions themselves. So next slide, please, Vera. So for produce farmers, and we'll talk through some of these things here over the next hour and a half here as part of this program, but just briefly, I think for produce farmers, the main takeaway of the survey was that you don't have to be GAP certified or have a specific certification to sell to a farm, but you really have to be able to demonstrate some form of food safety knowledge or practice, whether that's a food safety plan or standard operating procedures, or bringing the food service folks out for an on-farm tour. This is really important that you can show and talk about and demonstrate maybe a culture of food safety on your farm, even if you don't have one of those specific certifications. Next slide. For supply chain partners, and we'll hear a lot more about this based off of the work that KVCC's Valley Hub has been doing, kind of in that supply chain partner role, distributor role. They can serve definitely an important role in kind of the middle ground between farmers and institutions, and being able to translate what's happening on a farm, inform an institution about how they verify or how they work with farmers to ensure that the food that they're bringing in is safe, and really be a really important ally, I think, for farmers that are looking to get into institutional markets that may not have a specific already established food safety certification. Next slide. And then for institutional food service buyers, I think, what we found is that there's definitely a need for more education. There's a need for greater understanding about what it really means to grow food safely, transport that food safely, and then have it arrive at your institution. So that's kind of really where this program has, as I said, has kind of grown out of that need to help educate that specific audience on what on-farm food safety is really all about. I think this is my last slide coming up here. Yes. So for local food and food safety support organizations, those of us at the Farm Institution Network, Extension, MIFS, and the Michigan Group Gap Network, those of us that kind of work with farms and institutions and partners, the survey really demonstrated that there's a need for those organizations to be able to provide that education, to be able to develop programs that inform institutions, connect supply chain partners with farmers and institutions, and just kind of facilitate those different relationships and fill in the gaps that we've kind of demonstrated through this survey. And again, that's really what we're trying to do today. So hopefully that was kind of a little bit of background information on how we got here and why we're hosting this meeting specifically about on-farm food safety. We definitely continue to hear on-farm food safety as an issue, as a barrier, and as a really, really important emerging topic for farm institution work. So with that, I'm going to wrap that up. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot them in the chat, and I can help answer them as we move along or answer them here. But with that, we'll pass it along.
Is that me?
I think it's you. I don't see any questions coming in, but if you do have any questions related to the survey or anything, any of those results, feel free to shoot them in the chat, and I'll respond in the chat as you're presenting, Phil.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Garrett. Yeah, thanks everyone for hopping on today. Nice to see so many familiar faces in the participant list. So yeah, what I'm going to talk about a little bit is some of the essential produce safety stuff from farm to institution. And the approach, as I was writing this, the approach that I thought I'd take is not so much zooming in on specific practices here and there, because there's a lot of material out there that you can dive into to learn more about those specific practices. But I thought I'd zoom out a little bit and talk about things on more of that essential level, on more of that like foundational kind of like a ground floor level, like what is produce safety all about? So go ahead to the next slide, please. So we can't talk about produce safety, excuse me, if without talking about risk, right? Produce safety is all about this idea of risk and identifying risk and mitigating risks and things like that. But what is risk really? So risk via the ISO definition, the International Organization of Standardization, they define risk as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So let's unpack that a little bit. When we're talking produce safety, we have objectives, right? We want to deliver fresh produce that is free of pathogen contamination. We don't want produce that has Salmonella or E. coli or Listeria or any of the other ones on it. We want produce that is reasonably safe. So those are our objectives. So then how does uncertainty factor into that? How does uncertainty work its way into those systems? And what are the effects of that uncertainty on it? So if we're thinking about the supply chain from farm to institution, you have everything happening in the field. You have the actual like growing of the produce, you have soil preparation, soil amendments, you have irrigation, and things like that. You have making sure you're keeping wildlife out of the fields, all of that stuff. And then you have the actual harvesting and putting it into harvesting totes and carrying it to some kind of maybe packing house where they're potentially washing the produce and storing it in other bins or storing it on shelves and other maybe climate controlled rooms, those kinds of things. And finally, it's they load it onto trucks and transported to the grocery store, to the restaurant, to the institution, all those places. I'm oversimplifying that obviously, but just to give you an idea of the produce moves through all of these different phases throughout the supply chain. And the longer that supply chain is, the more opportunities there are for uncertainty to kind of work its way into that system, work its way into these different processes. And if you think about like a shorter supply chain, like a direct-to-consumer or a farm stand or even a CSA, there's not as much room for that uncertainty there. It's like, the farm, you go there and you get your produce. But as the supply chain gets longer and as there's more players in between, if there's like a food hub in there aggregating product, there's much more chance for that risk to be introduced. So next slide, please. So we know through through science and through data and through experience and through practice and from doing this a while, all of these different vectors, we call them like vectors or vector pathways or whatever, that pathogens can work their way onto the produce, right? So you have, we talked about manure, we talked about soil amendments. If you're using raw animal manure, that could, definitely contain some pathogens. And if you're using that or applying it improperly, that can increase that level of uncertainty because, well, do you know if some pathogens got on there or not? I'm not so sure. Rodents and pest management, in like storage areas and wildlife management in the field, things like that. Is another vector for pathogen contamination to happen. We talk about water all the time, like irrigation water, the quality of your irrigation water and how it's being applied to the plant, and what the water source is, and how do you know what the quality of that water at the source is, and also through the delivery system, all of those things. The people on your farm, do workers know how to wash their hands properly after using the bathroom or after eating? Are they eating in places they shouldn't be eating? Are they coming to work sick? Are they potentially picking up produce that might have dropped on the floor and putting it back in the bin? What other handling processes look like? What do the food and water contact surfaces, those kinds of things? What are those being cleaned and sanitized on a regular basis? And other farm tools like tractors and wheelbarrows. I had a really fun time trying to find the right best icons for the illustrations here. So we know what all of these different vectors are. We've learned what they are, how pathogens can work their way onto produce. So next slide, please. So what produce safety is all about then is mitigating risk. And finding different tools and best practices to both identify those risks, see how they apply to your specific operation, and then strategize and plan and use these tools to mitigate those risks and reduce those uncertainties. So to work through a handful of examples, we talked about manure earlier, right? So, if you're just applying raw manure, what are some ways you could reduce uncertainty on that front? Well, one of those ways is you could make sure you have a long time interval between when you're applying manure and when you're actually working in the field, or you're planting and harvesting and doing those kinds of activities. Or you could compost that manure. And even with composting, you could put it all in a pile and go, yep, it's steaming, so it's probably working. But again, you're not quite certain you've reduced the pathogen load. But what you can do then is you can say, you know what, I can control that by taking the temperature of my compost pile and following these established best practices to properly compost this animal manure. And I can make sure that it stayed above a certain temperature for a certain number of days, and I've turned it a certain number of times, and I've let it sit for a little while, and I've also made sure that it's protected from recontamination, that I'm storing it and using it properly, and all these other things that help reduce that risk, that help reduce that level of uncertainty, because that I've handled this properly to reduce that pathogen load, thereby reducing risk to pathogen contamination of my produce. For rodents and pests in your storage areas, you could set up monitoring traps and have a regular schedule when you're checking them and checking for evidence of them, and having procedures in place for if you do find them, what happens? How do you manage that then? Reducing risk is both trying to reduce that uncertainty on the front end, but and through prevention, but also reducing the effect of that uncertainty on the back end. So what happens if something goes wrong? Similarly with traceability procedures, if some kind of produce does become contaminated and you find out afterwards, are you then able to effectively contain the affected produce and recall it back so it doesn't spread further and doesn't get other people sick? So are you able to track your produce from where it was in the field through your own processes, and also to who it was sent to, who it was delivered to, who bought that produce? And that goes for every member of the supply chain. If you're a distributor, knowing what farm you bought it from, and then also knowing who you sold it to. So being able to track the produce through that is a way to help reduce that effect of uncertainty, reduce that risk on that front. And then also, for irrigation water, if you're watering from, say, a surface pond, you say, yep, it looks fine, but you're not really certain what the quality of that water's like. A herd of deer might have came through in the middle of the night and decided to have a beach party at your irrigation pond, and now your water's contaminated. So by employing tools such as water testing on a regular basis, maybe putting a fence around that irrigation pond, or maybe irrigating with a more protected water source like a well or a municipal source. And then also inspecting your irrigation delivery system. How does water get from the source to the actual crops? Are there potential areas that could lead to contamination in your water delivery system? Do you have proper backflow prevention to prevent contamination of the source from the field? And how are you irrigating? Is drip tape under plastic reduces that uncertainty quite a bit more than if you're just using a sprinkler. So all these different things, for your staff, the workers on your farm, one way you can reduce risk on that front is by having an annual training program where every year we're going to walk through all these things of like, how do you properly wash your hands? When should you wash your hands? What are the common main symptoms of these different illnesses? What do they look like? What do they feel like? And what happens if you feel them? What can you do on the farm? What can't you do on the farm? If you get a cut, what happens there? Where are the first aid kits? If something drops on the floor, what do you do with it? What are our regular cleaning and sanitization schedules for our food and water contact surfaces? How do we start up our packing room? All of these different things. And, not only are you training everybody, but hey, just so you know, all of these things that we just talked about are also written in our food safety plan. That's right over there. So if you ever have any questions, you can now go refer to those standard operating procedures and refresh yourself. And if you have any questions, you can refer to that for what you need to do. And we're also going to keep a training log that records everybody's name every year so that we know that if somebody was out that day, we can follow up with them later. So we know that we've hit everybody in our operation. So all these different things, all these different tools can be used to reduce risk on all these different fronts. Because there's lots of different vectors for pathogens to come in. There's lots of different tools that you can use to help reduce the risk of that pathogen contamination happening. Now, if you noticed throughout this whole time, that last 10 or so minutes that I've been talking, I haven't mentioned GAP once. And I haven't mentioned FSMA either, and the reason why is because I think, like I said at the beginning, sometimes we zoom in a little bit too much on the what, and it's better to come back out and talk about the why and what is the ultimate goal here. Because when we're talking about risk, we're not just talking about, oh, this is what the farm has to do. This is across the supply chain. Everybody has responsibility for this. So when we talk about GAP and we talk about FSMA, though, that is what we're talking about there is what role do standards have in this? Because it's one thing if you're a farm and it's like, okay, well, I understand that here are some of the vectors that pathogens can potentially contaminate my produce. So what am I gonna do? Okay, well, I should wash my hands. How long, and rather than having to figure out all of those things on your own, standards come in and say, hey, you know what? Through science, through experience, this is what our industry has decided are the best practices to reduce the risk on all these fronts. And so they'll lay out standards for, okay, you have to have a set cleaning and sanitization schedule for your food and water contact surfaces. You have to be testing your irrigation water X amount of times per year. You have to wash your hands for 20 seconds, not 15. You can wash it for 25 if you want to, but 20 is the time limit. You have to apply raw manure 120 days ahead of time. Things like that, saying that this is what our industry has decided are the best practices to reduce risk on all these fronts. And so there's two different ways to kind of approach that. And one is through regulation. That's what the Food Safety Modernization Act is all about. That essentially is saying, if you're growing food in America, here's the ground floor baseline of what you have to do. This is the bare minimum that you have to do as far as produce safety. And there's exemptions and exceptions, and it gets complicated. But by and large, this is what you have to do to be able to produce food in America. But it's one thing for a farm to do that, or anybody else in the supply chain to take that on. But when you're talking about business to business transactions, like it's one thing if I'm doing this, but how do I know if you, who I want to buy from, or you, who I want to sell to, are also doing this? And this is where the tool of third-party certification comes in, because that has a third party come into the situation, evaluate your operation against one of these standards, and Mariel's going to get to those here in a little bit, but you get evaluated against one of these standards, and they determine whether or not you meet their acceptance criteria, like you're complying with these best practices that we've said are the best, and have said sufficiently reduce the risk. If you're compliant with them, we, as a certifying body, will give you a certificate, which you can now then take to a buyer and say, hey, look, I am doing these practices on my farm. I have implemented these in my operation. Here's the verification for it. You can now have confidence that I am doing this, and you can trust me with it. And so third-party certification enables that interoperability between business partners in the supply chain. That's the role of certification. That's a lot of what I do with the Michigan Group Gap Network. And I think the final thing with all of that is that when you start thinking about things in this way, when we're talking about risk, we're talking about risk across the supply chain, it becomes a lot more from a buying perspective, from an institutional perspective. It becomes a lot more than just, okay, well, yep, you're certified, we're good to go. I've checked that box. But it's more a thing now of how are you empowering your supply chain, like Garrett was talking about a little bit ago. How are you connecting those you're buying with resources, with technical service providers through things like that MSU and MDARD and MIPS and KVCC and dozens of others have produced to help reduce their risk across the whole supply chain and bring up that culture of food safety that we keep talking about. How are you training your staff as a buyer on what some of these requirements might be, what the different certifications are, so that you, when you're having a conversation with the supplier, are able to say, oh, okay, yep, you're certified. Oh, yep, I can see that you are doing these practices, and you're able to have more of those conversations. I recently had a conversation with a large buyer out west, one of the farms I work with, and I was very surprised, for as large of a buyer as they were, that they were confusing USDA GAP with FSMA inspections. So there's a lot of work that has to be done on the institutional side of understanding what these different programs are, what farms have to go through, and how are we empowering and connecting the people in our supply chain with resources, and having more of a concerted effort culture of food safety approach, rather than just at the very end saying, okay, yep, you're certified with these handful of certifications that we accept, and that's good enough. So I think that was all that I had, just a quick overview of that. Again, produce safety is all about risk. Risk is the effect of uncertainty on your objectives. We know the vectors that pathogens can take, and so produce safety becomes trying to reduce the risk along those different vectors, leading towards more of a culture of food safety and using all the different tools available to us. So just like Garrett, I'll be watching the questions in the comments. I can answer them now if any pop up quickly, or I can respond to them via typing. But I think now I would love to kick it back to Mariel to talk a little bit more about some of those certifications and other programs. So thanks all.
Thank you, Phil. Really appreciate that overview. And I think it leads really well into this next section. I don't see any questions in the chat yet, so I'll go ahead and get started and can answer any that come in. Oops, there we go. Okay, so to kind of start us off, I wanted to put some of the major on-farm produce safety programs on a spectrum. And this spectrum kind of goes from the very baseline standards, which are under the FSMA produce safety rule, or that Phil kind of introduced to us briefly, and then kind of going into some of the more low-hanging fruit type programs. And then as we move along toward the right side of the spectrum, we get into some of the more involved auditing programs that are requiring not only to have a written food safety plan, but also to have an auditor come in and evaluate what you're doing with a series of record keeping protocols and things like that. So just to kind of put it in perspective, but we're going to talk about each one of these individually. But the only one that is regulatory is the FSMA produce safety rule compliance, and the rest of these programs are voluntary. So a farm either chooses to participate on their own, or they're encouraged to do so in order to sell to a particular buyer. And I have the GFSI program is not really on the spectrum, and I'll explain why in a couple of slides, but just keep that acronym in mind. We'll get there. That is not actually a certification program, but it does come up, and you may have heard of the GFSI program before. So we'll definitely talk about that as well. So to kick us off, let's talk about the FSMA produce safety rule. So some of you may have heard of this, some of you may be very familiar with this, but for those that haven't, the FSMA, or Food Safety Modernization Act, is a really, really large piece of legislation that has a lot of different components. But one particular component of that rule is the first ever, actually, standards that govern produce production. And so prior to this rule coming into play in the last few years, produce was never regulated at the federal level before. So this program is regulated under FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and it covers all produce farms with a few exemptions. So those farms that are exempted tend to be because they don't sell very much in terms of their gross sales over the years, or they have all of their produce going into processing, which would kill off the pathogens of concern, or there's a list of produce items that have been designated as rarely consumed raw. So there's some exemptions for farms that they would not necessarily have to comply with this rule, but it does cover most produce production in the United States. So most farms that you're working with are probably at a scale that they're have to be in compliance, or at least have to have some paperwork filled out to say that they have a qualified exemption. And I'm not going to go into what all this is because it'll just confuse us at this point in time. But if you want to learn more about the ins and outs of the produce safety rule, MSU Extension does offer training in the rule. So we can tell you all about it, but I'm not going to do that today because it's too much. Basically, what you need to know is that this rule really is the baseline standards of safe food production. And it covers 4 different aspects of produce growing and processing on the farm. So not processing, growing, packing, holding of produce, and harvesting. So those are the 4 categories that fall into this rule. And there are a number of things that produce growers need to do to comply with the rule, and those are practices. There's also a number of records that need to be kept, and there's a training requirement for one person from the farm to go through a full day of training on the produce safety rule, and then there's also an annual training requirement for all farm workers at any level of the farm. And that includes volunteers or unpaid family members as well. So everyone on that farm needs to have some sort of baseline produce safety training in order to be in compliance with this rule. So that's in addition to all of the other record keeping requirements and practices. The practices that are covered by this rule are mostly aligned with GAP, which stands for Good Agricultural Practices, with some differences, particularly around the water testing requirements. But the practices in general do kind of meet those industry standards for good agricultural practices. Under this program, there are inspections, and in Michigan, these inspections are conducted through MDARD. We have produce inspectors who work for MDARD that carry out the inspections of produce safety rule compliance. And those happen periodically. They're not on a regular basis, as you will see with some of the audit programs that happen more regularly. And then one last program that we have in Michigan specifically is this on-farm readiness review. So you may hear a grower say that they've gone through an on-farm readiness review, and that means that a team of folks has come to their farm to assess how well they are lining up with the FSMA regulations, and that's separate than an actual inspection. That is a voluntary program that someone can participate in to see how well they are aligning with FSMA standards. So that is, in a nutshell, a very complex world of produce safety rule, but a lot of those different vectors that Phil talked about are what is included in the education around the produce safety rule, and it informs the practices that are outlined. So next, as we move from the regulatory environment to the voluntary environment, the very basic thing that a farm can do is to write down what they're doing when it comes to produce safety. This, although voluntary, is required by some audit programs. So GAP certification, USDA GAP certification does require a written food safety plan. Most of the other third-party verification programs do require a written food safety plan. But a farm can have a written food safety plan even if they're not being audited, being certified, being verified. This can be a standalone document that a farm puts together. And generally what goes into this written plan are things like farm policies to address all of those different risk factors that Phil introduced to us. Also standard operating procedures for any produce safety related behaviors or tasks on the farm. And also record keeping is generally a part of this as well. So it's basically either a big binder or an electronic document that contains all of this information that a farm has established about how they're going to follow these best practices around food safety. And it can be used to guide their worker training. It can be used to comply with an audit or to show a buyer how they are taking actions toward all of these different risk factors. So it can be a really useful tool in and of itself. Okay, so next we're going to get into some of the audits. So I wanted to bring in this idea of GFSI before we get into that, just so you understand what this concept means. So GFSI stands for Global Food Safety Initiative, and it's not a standard in and of itself, but it's a recognition of other food safety standards that meet a set of benchmarks. So essentially it's a benchmarking program for produce safety standards. So as I go through some of these other programs, you're going to see the ones that are, they'll have an indication that they meet GFSI. And so that just means that they meet those benchmarking standards. Okay, so first program, which is not a certification, but you do receive a certificate. So I want to make that really clear. This program is amazing. We have this program in Michigan. It's a couple years old now, and it is really great, especially for farms that have no background in produce safety whatsoever, or even those that do, but it's a really, really low risk, low cost way to get your foot in to produce safety verification. So the Michigan Produce Safety Risk Assessment is a voluntary, free, and confidential program that is administered through our Michigan conservation districts. Across the state, there's a number of produce safety technicians that work out of the conservation districts, and they administer this assessment on the farm. They work one-on-one with the grower, to help them go through an entire risk assessment of their operation. And that risk assessment document is aligned with the FSMA produce rule. So it can also help a farm see where they stand in relation to those regulations as well. So the participating farms receive a certificate of completion, and they can use this logo that you see here on the screen that says that they're an on-farm produce safety participating farm. So the next topic is USDA GAP. So again, GAP stands for Good Agricultural Practices. And GAP is also a voluntary program, but it's a fee-based program. So we're kind of moving into the next level now. So we went from having a written plan to having someone come out to your farm, and now we're having someone come out to our farm and we're paying them to get a certification. So this involves an annual audit of the farm's practices as well as their paperwork. So the written food safety plan is a requirement of USDA GAP, and the auditor is going to be checking that paperwork very closely to make sure it aligns with what they're observing at the farm. And USDA GAP can be achieved either individually, where an auditor or a farm contacts the auditor to come out and do an audit, and that's the end of the equation, or it can be done through the group GAP program, which I will speak to in a couple slides. So USDA GAP, whether you do it individually or as part of USDA group GAP, there's a couple different standards that you can get audited to. So three of the major ones are USDA GAP or GIP. So GAP is, again, Good Agricultural Practices, and GIP, GHP, stands for Good Handling Practices. And this is a points-based checklist. So the grower has to get 80% of those points on the audit checklist in order to pass the audit. There's also a standard called Harmonized GAP, and Harmonized GAP works a little bit differently. It's not a points-based checklist. It's more of a, you're doing things well, you need some improvement, or you need a lot of improvement kind of deal. And that one is actually in alignment with FSMA. And the idea behind Harmonized GAP was to try to harmonize the audit programs that exist out in the world into one program, because growers were being asked by buyers to comply with a lot of different standards. So they were being asked by one buyer to use this third-party auditor, another buyer to use this party auditor. So the intention of the harmonized standard was to try to make one standard that would work and satisfy any buyer requirement. So that's kind of the story behind that. There's also a Harmonized GAP Plus standard that meets those GFSI benchmarks. So I think, sometimes, like Phil was saying, it's hard to sometimes tell the difference between GAP and FSMA. That often becomes a point of confusion. And then to even, get your head around that there's multiple auditing standards within USDA GAP, and that there's other people that offer GAP certification, it can get pretty confusing. So that's why we're hoping to kind of break it down in this way. And you may still feel like it's too much information. So we're here to help you as you're working through this on your own. But just know that, it is a program that has many facets. It can be done in different ways. It's very flexible. So one of the methods for obtaining USDA GAP certification is through the Michigan Group GAP Network. So this farmers that participate in the Michigan Group GAP Network are participating in the same standards. They can certify to GAP GIP, Harmonized, or Harmonized Plus standards in a group format. And they can do this in a way that is a little bit more supportive than just the traditional GAP method, where you would contact an auditor to come out to your farm. So in this case, we have regional groups of producers and we have internal auditors who are trained to the same standards as someone from the USDA. And there is a portion of the group each year that is actually audited directly by the USDA, but everyone gets an audit each year by someone that is auditing to those same standards. And so it's a way of kind of distributing the accountability amongst the group, and a way for everyone to make sure that they're getting all the education they need, all the support that they need in order to be really successful in achieving their GAP certification. So that's one of the main benefits of doing it this way as in a network, is that you have access to a lot of educational resources and support resources to make sure that you are optimizing your produce safety program and that you are going to be really successful in achieving that certification. So you can learn more about this by talking to Phil, for one. He's he's right here and he's our expert. But there's also a website that you can learn more about the Group GAP program, and that's migroupgap.com. Okay, so again, that's just one way that growers have, one option growers have to achieve GAP certification under those different audit schemes. Then, to make things a little bit more complicated, there's other third parties besides the USDA that offer GAP certification, and they may audit to the harmonized standard, or they may maintain their own standard. And sometimes we've heard from growers that these standards can change pretty frequently, even on an annual basis. There are different standards that they're being asked to comply with. So those standards are determined by whoever is the one performing the audits. So you may have heard of Primus or SCS. Companies like this are some of the other third parties that do GAP audits out there. These are, again, also voluntary programs. They're fee-based programs, and they may or may not meet those GFSI benchmarks depending on what which audit standards they're using. Then we have SQF, which stands for Safe Quality Food. This is also a voluntary fee-based program. It's also an audit program. And this is a HACCP-based program. So many of you are probably familiar with HACCP from working in food service. This is typically one that is used by really large-scale farms that are selling to national or multinational companies. And actually the certifiers themselves are licensed by SQF, and this standard does meet the GFSI benchmarks. So in Michigan, we're really, really fortunate because we have an amazing group of folks who work together to help our farms be really successful in navigating this maze of farm food safety programs and all of the things in between. So there's a website that you can visit for Michigan on-farm produce safety if you'd like to learn more. But the kind of the three main players involved here are MSU Extension, the produce safety technicians that I mentioned that work out of the conservation districts, and then our produce inspectors from MDARD. We all work really collaboratively together to do grower training, to do programs like the produce safety risk assessment, the on-farm readiness reviews, farm visits, and helping growers develop their farm food safety plans. So you can kind of see under these raindrops where we overlap a little bit. So MSU Extension and the produce safety technicians really work together closely for those produce grower trainings, for the on-farm readiness reviews, and then we kind of do our own work kind of around those two things to support the growers. And then the MDARD inspectors are doing those FSMA inspections, but we also stay in really close communication with them so that they know what's going on in our world, and we know what's going on in their world. And it's a very collaborative, risk-based approach to helping growers to do the best that they can when it comes to mitigating all of those different produce safety risks on their farm. All right, so same deal. If you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. But with that, I'm going to hand it over to our friends at Valley Hub.
Hello. Okay, so I'm Rosie Florian. I'm the Valley Hub manager. And first we'll tell you a little bit about what it is we do for KVCC as part of our community college, and then kind of get into what it is, how we approach institutional buyers asking for local produce. So Lauren, if you want to start it out, next slide, please.
Sure. So I'm Lauren. I'm the marketing and outreach coordinator here at Valley Hub. So, wait, did the slide? Can we click the next slide? Okay, so I'll just give a brief background here. So our three major ingredients of Valley Hub is our fresh cuts, so our fresh cut processing of local fruits and vegetables, our logistics, which is our distribution, essentially point A to point B, and then our urban farm as well. You can click the next slide. And of course, we are part of KVCC, so education is our #1 crop, grounded at the intersection of food production, social justice, environmental sustainability, nutrition, and health. So we provide an opportunity for in-depth learning for the community, but more specifically for our culinary students who have several classes on site at the Food Innovation Center. They also get to do work on our urban farm and kind of see what we're doing in the hub when it comes to fresh cuts and processing. You want to click the next slide for me? Okay, so our urban farm, this is where we showcase our sustainable agriculture practices. We have a 5-acre site with an indoor grow room, heated greenhouse, outdoor raised beds, and 2 passive solar houses. So this is run by our farm staff here at Valley Hub or at the Food Innovation Center, along with volunteers and students who, as part of our culinary program, will come and take classes here and get to learn a bit about agriculture as well. So they're actually learning, from the seed to the plate, a full circle learning opportunity to really see the food system as a whole, rather than just working in a kitchen.
Another thing is that part of our Valley Hub Urban Farm is GAP certified through the Michigan Group GAP. So what happens to the produce we grow, it goes into our logistics and aggregation and makes it into purchases from all sorts of different customers.
We could go to the next slide. Okay, so Valley Hub processing, this is where we have all of our fresh cut local options. So you can kind of see in the background, this is what our actual hub looks like. It's a flexible lab, so everything is on wheels, which is super convenient for us. And we are equipped with everything we need to wash, peel, chop, and freeze produce, which we're packaging seasonally. And this has also been really great to work with, some of our bigger institutional customers to discuss, what type of produce they're going to want when, so we can plan ahead, and when that produce is in season, process and freeze it for them to purchase at a later point. And actually, this past week was our kind of big full circle moment where we grew jalapenos on our farm, we processed them in our processing facility, diced them, froze them, and packaged them, and they will likely be featured in Bakewell's quiches, if anybody's familiar with that. So that's really exciting for us when we get to have those, full circle moments of having grown it, processed it, and putting it back out to, the community to be used in awesome products. I don't want to miss anything. Oh, so our processing facility as well is kind of a big draw for a lot of those institutional customers who are looking to remove a few steps in the cooking process. So they can either be getting ready to serve vegetables from us or, ready to cook, but we can take a few steps out of that for them, make it a little bit easier, and it's still local produce, which is awesome. Rosie, did I miss anything there? You want to jump in?
No, that's great.
Okay, cool. You can click the next slide for me. Okay, our logistics, which is really a foundational part of the hub and what makes it, so convenient for institutional customers. So it's our local aggregation and distribution. This is reducing barriers between producers and consumers, especially because, we could use Bronson as an example. But, you know, they have a really large intention to be purchasing local products. And prior to the hub, you know, they would have had to be making that contact themselves, reaching out to farms. And then, of course, you have the farm food safety component of it as well. Whereas now they can log on to our online platform where we have, you know, an array of produce, meats, eggs, other locally produced products, order as much as whatever products they want and have it delivered all at one time on one invoice. So that's a really, you know, big draw for a lot of institutional customers who have their own barriers and guidelines they have to work within. And then, of course, we're actively managing the distribution of source identified local and regional food products. So creating a safe avenue for large institutional customers to be able to get those local products. And I think
Yeah.
we can click that.
One thing I would say about this is that it keeps the farmers on the farm farming. That's their expertise. Not driving around on a hot day. So let's see here. So we have been involved in the Group GAP Southwest Michigan cluster with Phil for several years. I'm an internal auditor of that program and a couple other staff are. Over the years with Mariel, Jen Silveri, Phil, lots and lots of people. We've done the summits at KVCC. We have a good facility for hosting those kinds of conferences when they exist in person. And hope to do more once they come back. And then are part of the Michigan Produce Safety Working Group. Next slide, please. So on the right, there are some logos of our a couple institutional customers: Bronson Methodist Hospital, South Haven Public Schools, Berry and Risa, and the YWCA in Kalamazoo. We've had lots of connections to lots of different institutions looking for local produce or locally produced food. And you know, I think there's some disconnect between what it is they think they want and what it is that is available, realistic. But some of our, you know, Lauren already talked to this a little bit, but we are speaking with farmers and assuring that their food is safe. So they name us on their liability insurance. We require that they have a farm food safety plan, and they are part of our traceability system. So we have an online platform that records all orders being placed by which customers from which farm, and then lot numbers and invoice system. And so farms, when they're invoicing us, are making sure to put important information on there. It has to be recallable. We've never had to recall anything, but that is an emphasis that we give with them. Just trying to think. Another thing from our farms, I've heard a lot of requests for, like, okay, we know how to sell the farmers markets, we know how to sell to grocery stores or these like kind of smaller direct to customer sales, but we need help getting our food into larger purchases. And institutions are purchasing and feeding food to people every day, all year long. So the farms are really asking, like, can you help us get to those kinds of customers? We don't, you know, don't just do everything we already do something that we can't, you know, there's a barrier of some sort there. Let's see, it's been about 10 minutes. So I wanted to bring up a couple of different examples. We had one school system a few years ago when they wanted to purchase from Valley Hub, lots and lots of apples. We got to the point in a conversation where they asked well, are all of the farms GAP certified? And the answer is that no, we don't require GAP certification for every single farm. We have a few farms, and our own farm are GAP certified, but they said, well, it's the law. They really thought that is the law. And you know, that was right around when FSMA came out. And I think that there was a lot of emphasis on that, and people were trying to discover what that meant. And at the same time, it's not the law, although we do have conversations with our farms regarding farm and food safety. But yeah, the other example I had, there was another food system or food service third party for a local school system who was willing to take our own Valley Hubs Urban Farm GAP certification in placement of what they would need to buy as an approved vendor. If we were an approved vendor, all farms would have to be GAP certified that they bought their food from, but up to a certain amount as we were getting going, they thought, well, that'll be fine. That'll be in place. That'll be good enough. But, you know, so I don't think they even understood like what that GAP or well, I said gap, but I mean that disconnect between what they're looking for, what they need, what we offer. So meeting customers where they're at, you know, those two examples I think line up with like not every food service buyer has training or education to get them to the job that they're now in, and they are interested in purchasing local. So we really try to connect them with other resources like Mariel or well, you know, there's a lot going on that we, as Mariel just showed with those raindrops, that we can connect them with. So let's see, what else am I missing here? Are there any questions, I guess? No.
Rosie, I have a question.
Yeah.
I guess what's your process if there's an institution that's like a new customer or somebody that you're looking to connect with? Like, how do you talk about the food that you can provide? Because you do have sources that are GAP certified, sources that are not GAP certified. Like, how do you kind of like try and educate those buyers as you're going through that process of developing relationships with them?
Well, it kind of comes back to which customer it is. South Haven, you know, that customer doesn't require GAP certification for everything, but did have questions about it. So not a lot of barriers to get into, like, well, now every single fall they buy, you know, 20 cases of apples every week. But another place may have restrictions, and so it's really, I guess, usually it's like, what do they need from me or from us, I mean, and that can usually kind of nip the conversation from going faster or really just starting out. So YWCA is one that we're working with right now. They are building a new facility, a new childcare center in Kalamazoo. They already have one, so they're going to need more produce. They're going to need to feed a lot more kids. It's a 24-hour facility, which is really sweet. And right away we could just start. Today we're making carrot sticks for them. And trying out products just immediately, like depending on what their menu requires. And then, you know, their barriers aren't, you know, that everything has to be GAP certified. Yeah.
Hey, Rosie, I know that Valley Hub has supported growers financially in the past to get certified around food safety or to get education around it. Could you speak to that at all?
Sure. Do you mean hosting trainings and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and also subsidizing the cost of certification through some of the grants you've
Oh,
written.
yeah. Right. So let me move my screen over a little. So I have some notes. It won't let me. Also, Rachel Bear is on this, and we are working on kind of some ideas in the same vein, like what are the kinds of food safety, farm safety trainings or needs for our farms in the form of like the LFPP grants or other kinds of financing. So yeah, actually, well, I would look to, we were actually talking with Garrett's slideshow. It was great information that could inform us what we may do in the future. But we've done a lot of, well, partnerships with you at MSU. I'm not really sure what the answer is to your question.
I can jump in. Do you want me to jump in, Rosie?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we've had some, hi, I'm Rachel Bear. I'm the Director for Sustainable Food Systems at Kalamazoo Valley. So I work with Lauren and Rosie at Valley Hub. And we've written a few grants in the past, a specialty crop block grant in 2016, and then we're currently working under a local food promotion program grant. And those both had elements of kind of launching Valley Hub and the operations of it, but then also supporting farmers with food safety training. And through those grants, we've been able to certify a few auditors for the Southwest Michigan group of the Group GAP, subgroup of the Group GAP, and that's Marielle and Garrett and Randall Davis, who used to work with us, still does in a limited capacity, and Rosie and now Ben Bausma on our staff. And we, in the current grant we're working under, we actually have funding to pay the Group GAP audit fee for 15 farms and offer them up to 20 hours of one-on-one consulting with those internal auditors. And we've actually had really limited uptake on that because we're not having buyers demand that certification. And so what we're learning, and Marielle's presentation was actually really helpful, is it's all reinforcing, all the information is reinforcing each other, that it's not one size fits all. And if we really want to support farms in meeting their food safety goals, we need to meet them where they're at and take them where they want to go, not just Group GAP for everybody, because that might not be necessary for everybody. And so the objective that I'm actually writing into our next local food promotion grant that I'm working on right now is for a certain number of farmers, TBD, to make significant progress on their own self-identified food safety goals. So whether that's going from nothing at all to having a written farm food safety plan, or whether that's going from Group GAP to harmonized GAP plus, whatever it is that they want to do, having us work with all of the great partners in Michigan that are doing this work so well to provide that support system for them to move where they want to go. And then because we're a food hub, we can also kind of offer the carrot of an institutional customer at the end, hopefully. Carrot. I'll end with that.
Thanks, Rachel.
Sure. Thanks, Rosie. Thanks, Lauren.
What's next?
All right, well, we have a quiet group, but hopefully some more questions will stir as we are sitting with all this information that we threw a lot at you all today. But hopefully you will think of some as we go along, either later today, or feel free to reach out to Garrett or I or the speakers. We can provide contact information at the end today, and want to make sure that you get all the support that you need as you navigate all of these different programs and options for farm produce safety. So thank you to all of our presenters for all that great information that you shared. All right, let me get back to those slides here. Okay, so one last plug for questions, but again, keep those coming in the chat. We can answer them after the next section as well. And I'm going to turn it back over to Garrett then.
All right, so as we typically do with our MIFIN virtual network meetings, we have just a couple quick updates, some things that are going on here with the Farm and Institution Network. So next slide, please, Mariel. Well, first and foremost, you saw that lovely picture of the asparagus popping up through the ground. That is one of the better signs of springtime in Michigan, in my opinion. And just wanted to make sure that you were all reminded, aware, those of you that work with institutions or institutional purchasers yourselves, that all of the work we've done from 2014 through 2019 as part of our Cultivate Michigan local sourcing campaign around highlighting specific featured foods from Michigan on a seasonal basis. All of that great information about those foods is available. Sourcing information is available in the Cultivate Michigan sourcing guide. And you can find that at the link there at the bottom of the page. But springtime, asparagus, we all love asparagus. It's the best time of year. We also featured beef as one of our spring foods in years past. So you can see spring has been some of our different protein products that we've had. We've had milk and eggs, kale, and then onions. So don't forget, as you're thinking about winding down for your school season, or if you still have some 10 cents a meal funds to spend, there's lots of great products out there for your institutions to be purchasing locally from Michigan farmers. Next slide. Also wanted to remind folks that there are a couple of things we have on our calendars here that I wanted to remind you about. So we have our future virtual network meetings coming up here in the next couple of months. We do these on an every other month basis. We have one on July 19th from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. This is, we're planning to look at, as part of that virtual network meeting, supplier diversity and community impact. So the Center for Regional Food Systems has been doing a project around anchor institutions and this idea of supplier diversity and how much of an impact are institutions having on the local communities in which they're based through sourcing and through how they're accessing different products. So that'll be a really interesting conversation. I think Noel Balachik from the center is going to be leading that. We've got an October 21st meeting that is going to be from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. And that's going to be really looking at seasonal menu planning and some of the ideas around that. And so that should be an exciting topic for some of our institutional partners. And then for our December 16th virtual network meeting, which will also be from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m., we're going to be just looking for an opportunity for our network members to provide some feedback, telling us what's on their mind, what things are they looking at for the years ahead, so that we can start kind of planning our 2022 calendar based off of a lot of that great information. Also did want to, and maybe Lindsay Scalera can chime in, there is going to be a fall 2021 Michigan Good Food Charter gathering of some kind. Is there a specific date held for that, Lindsay? Yes, there is a date. October 13th through the 15th. So mark that on your calendars. Get excited about that. I know I don't know if this is going to be in person this year or not. We're planning to, but I know I missed seeing everybody in person at last year's summit. So hoping we get that opportunity to gather in a way that might be some more in-person way.
It's virtual.
It's virtual.
It'll be virtual, but we are going to plan for 2022 to do at least maybe one or two sort of launches, like one up in the Upper Peninsula maybe, and one somewhere here downstate in person in 2022. Okay.
Some point we'll see each other in person again. So yeah, look forward for information for that 13th to the 15th. And if you have any other looking to keep up to date on events, definitely visit our cultivatemichigan.org website for any related updates for events. Probably will be virtual events, but at some point there will be some actual face-to-face events listed on there. And then I think next slide might just be any announcements for the good of the group. So any of our folks that are on the call today have anything they wanted to chime in about? Let us know about if you have any events coming up that folks might be interested in that you wanted to make us aware of, or just any additional thoughts or questions related to the content of today's meeting. Please feel free to shout that out. I was thinking, seeing that we have a lot of folks that fill the roles of supply chain partners or support organizations for this farm to institution work and for food safety work. I'm curious if any of those of you that work in those spaces have any additional thoughts about how we can really kind of build on this work of educating folks all across the supply chain, how we can help meet some of these needs that were demonstrated in those initial slides from the survey, and provide information, the important information that Mariel talked about. So I'm just wanting to throw it all out to you to see if you have any thoughts about, or what strategies we might look to as a network, as individual organizations, to really support this work of food safety in farm to institution. I think we've really seen it become a more and more important aspect of this work. 10 cents a meal has elevated the aspect of food safety, with a lot more institutions coming into the local purchasing landscape. So curious if anybody has any thoughts, and those of us speakers, Lauren, Rosie, if you have any thoughts, Phil, it'd be great to hear them.
I'll just chime in and say we're planning to do another webinar on this topic as well. So we'll send that information out to the group. And also later this summer, we're recording some videos on a farm that actually show some of the process that goes into doing a Michigan produce safety risk assessment and a gap audit. So look for those resources coming soon.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great point, Mariel. I think it'll be really, really interesting for folks to see exactly what goes into some of these certifications and audits, and wrap their head around what that actually looks like when we're talking about a GAP certification or on-farm food safety assessment. Well, this certainly is a quiet group today. So if there isn't any comments, thoughts, questions, we can give you back half hour of your afternoon. But we really appreciate all of you joining today. This meeting has been recorded, so we'll be posting that recording up on our MSU Extension website, as well as our Center for Regional Food Systems website, so it can be shared out after for folks that weren't able to attend in person. But we really appreciate everybody joining, and yeah, we'll wrap up a little early.